We are, as American citizens, no longer enslaved to the major networks for our news. Creative ways to reach and influence millions of our citizens through the use of social networking, digital media, blogs, and interactive websites have popped up that have been a great help to us all. Coming now to moderate our panel about this phenomenon, would you please welcome the Family Research Council's Director of Online Communications, Jared Bridges.
Thank you, Gil. How many of you out here have read news from the internet this morning? How many of you are reading it right now in this room as we speak? Well, we have three of the brightest stars from the new media world with us today, and I'd like to introduce first Ed Morrissey. Ed writes at hotair.com, and he hosts an internet talk show every weekday. He began as an independent blogger 8 years ago at Captain's Quarters. Called him Captain Ed back then. And he has also been published in the New York Sun, the Washington Post, the New York Post, and other newspapers. He writes a regular column at The Week, and he also co-hosts a Twin Cities radio program on Saturday afternoon called the Northern Alliance Radio Network. He lives in Minnesota with his wife, Marcia, who writes regularly at pathos.com, his son, daughter-in-law, and 2 granddaughters. Ed. Next, we have Kathryn Jean Lopez. Kathryn is a current editor-at-large of National Review Online, where she's written and edited for more than a decade. She's an award-winning opinion journalist who's been praised for her editorial daring. Lopez is also a nationally syndicated columnist with United Media's Newspaper Enterprise Association, and she's known as Kalo on the internet. And lastly, we have Joe Carter. He is the online editor for First Things, and he is also an adjunct professor of journalism at Patrick Henry College. He's a 15-year Marine Corps veteran, and he previously served as the managing editor for Culture 11 and the East Texas Tribune, and he also started the popular evangelical blog Evangelical Outpost. He's also been the director of research and rapid response for the Mike Huckabee for President campaign, worked at the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity, and was my predecessor at Family Research Council. He's the co-author of How to Argue Like Jesus, Learning Persuasion from History's Greatest Communicator. So all you guys are in kind of the catbird seat within the new media, but from your standpoint, does the media, whether new or old, get the values voter?
I'll start. Do they get the value voter? Well, I think it's safe to say that the mainstream media doesn't get the value voter. I think sometimes we in the new media also don't get the values voters, which is one of the reasons why conferences like this are so important, is to bring people together so that we can see the exchange of ideas and get to what drives you, and what common threads there are among the different varieties of conservatives in the political scene today. And I think that there's a tremendous amount of crossover between the values voters, summit conferees, Tea Party conferees, fiscal conservatives, social conservatives, I think have a tremendous amount in common, starting with basic philosophical tenets of individual rights, individual liberties, and the core values that inform that. And all of those things come from, I think, a sense of shared experience in the conservative movement. So I think that there's plenty there that brings us all together. But sometimes I think we can do a better job of appreciating what some of the nuances and some of the differences are as well.
I think the answer is in bits and pieces sometimes. And again, yes, conferences like this are helpful because you have media in the back who may not be hanging out with you on a daily basis. Part of it is telling your story, and not just, frankly, telling your story from here or from your blog site, which are all important, but also being a part of the newsroom mix and the cultural mix. You know, I'm willing to bet that most people here don't watch the show Grey's Anatomy, which is on Thursday nights on ABC. But I have done the work for you, and Grey's Anatomy, and there's another show on it after Private Practice. Grey's Anatomy is a hospital show, emergency room kind of show. And then the one after it is actually about a fertility clinic, a women's clinic. And so you can imagine it's not particularly coming from a pro-life, conservative, Christian sort of point of view. On the other hand, in fact, the creator of both shows is on the board of Planned Parenthood or NARAL, in California. And yet, just because they're trying to find good storylines, and they also know, frankly, the experiences of themselves and their friends, every once in a while you see little windows. For instance, first episode of Grey's Anatomy this season, one of the doctors had an abortion. And what you're seeing, though, is how it's destroying her marriage. You saw how an older doctor on this other show, Private Practice, had an abortion early on, and well, now she's getting on in years, and she really wants a child, and she's, I don't know, maybe regretting her abortion. Not particularly coming from a pro-life agenda, but when you hear the creator of the show talk about how they put stories together, obviously the people who are in the room with her make a difference. So even though she's coming from a NARAL point of view, if she has people who are creative, who decided, you know, I have a dream and I want to go to Hollywood and I want to be a screenwriter, well, they help make these stories at the end of the day. So I would just say, it's important in telling our stories not to just be in our own ghettos, in our own safe places, but to encourage people to go out and engage the culture fully.
Thanks. Joe?
I would say I think one of the problems, the reason they don't get it, because we don't get it ourselves. We've watered down the word conservative so much that just about anything can fit in the conservative movement now. We have people who support the most radically progressive agenda in the history of America, gay marriage, and you can still be called a conservative. What does it mean? That's not conservative. That's just a liberal who likes tax cuts. So I think if the conservative movement portrays itself as this, and the outside world says, well, this is consistent with conservatism, why don't you just move to that type of conservatism? So we watered it down where conservative doesn't mean anything anymore, so the outside world doesn't understand why we hold the principles we do. And I think we need to work very hard to communicate what conservative means and narrow it down to social conservatives should be redundant. You can't be a conservative without being concerned about social issues.
All right. So in what ways do you think the media actually affect public perception of the social issues?
I'm sorry.
What ways do the media affect the public's perception of social issues?
Well, the media sets the norm for what's allowable, and has kind of a vicious cycle. The media portrays certain issues as normal, such as gay marriage. It's normal out there. So what they do is they put this out there. People start to think, well, if this is what my friends and family and neighbors think, well, I guess maybe I should think it too. So the media then goes and polls these same people, and it comes back, and there's a little bump in the approval ratings for these issues. So the media portrays that and makes it seem like, we'll see, even more people believe it. And the cycle just continues until eventually all the social issues are what the media has created because we're afraid to stand up and say, no, this is not what we believe, this is not what we stand for, and we're not going to let the media control the image of what America stands for.
One of the reasons I love Andrew Breitbart, an old friend of mine, is that he will not accept those norms. And he will not accept the way that the media frames the issue, as so many people here in your daily lives are teaching your families differently, or teaching your friends differently, perhaps using social media, since that's the theme of this panel. the media obviously plays a tremendous role, but here is the value of alternative media. And again, I think also, but I think in using the alternative media, and I totally agree with Joe, we have to know who we are and be confident in that and not let the mainstream media or whatever it is that's saying something different get us down. And I also think we have to remain rigorous. You know, one of the reasons that first of all, National Review was, of course, founded by Bill Buckley, and he not only established an alternative media, the National Review, he also was on PBS every week, the longest running public affairs program for, I don't know if it's been beat by somebody by now, but point being, he was telling the story to conservatives. He was being a fusionist, bringing a number of different flavors of people who considered themselves right wing, and try to figure out what were what's the common definition here, and what do we have in common, and where can we work together to, I don't know, end the Cold War, which he and Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and John Paul II and all these heroes were instrumental in. But as we're using new media to tell our stories and combat the whatever mainstream myth is out there that we're combating, we also have to make sure we actually know what it is that we believe. And in knowing, I think, actually what you're talking about, getting your facts right, and being deeply rooted, both faith-wise and intellectually, that's going to give you the confidence to keep doing what you're doing. You know, Rush Limbaugh isn't famous just because he's a good talker. He is famous and successful because he knows what he's talking about. And on any given day, he can talk about it for 3 hours and be entertaining. And that's what you want to be able to do in whatever it is that you're doing, whatever your role is in the conservative, pro-life, pro-family movement. Know what you're talking about and be a happy warrior in doing so.
I think it's amazing when you take a look back, say 15, 20 years ago, and you look at the media landscape then and you look at the media landscape now. And I mean, this is even, I can go back 30 years. You know, there was, and this is in my lifetime, I mean, when I was a teenager, you got news either through a dead tree delivery on your front porch step, or from one of 3, count them, 3 sources on your television, and maybe a local community affairs radio program that had a couple of people who were about this far apart politically debating the issues of the day. Things have changed a lot, and I think we have to recall this and recall that this is a blessing. Because as the media has become more democratized, as platforms, the cost of publishing has come down to 0, it is much easier for social conservatives, well, for everybody, to tell their own story and to frame their own story. And this is an access that we didn't have 30 years ago. Maybe we didn't have as much need for it 30 years ago in some cases. But we didn't have that ability 30 years ago. We have that ability now. And so it's important to make sure that we are leveraging that in order to tell our story properly, and as Kathryn said, accurately and definitively. And I think that actually counters some of the issues that we have had with the media molding the message. Because when it comes down to it, editors at different media outlets, regardless of whether they're newspapers, magazines, broadcast, entertainment, films in the theaters, it's the people who own that channel that are going to make the decisions as to which story to tell. Every single one of you can be your own broadcast channel. Every single one of you can be your own editor. And if you do that, if you tell your stories, you will balance out the effect that the media has. There are plenty more of us that can tell those stories.
Well, kind of along those lines, you had in the 1960s, the literary critic Marshall McLuhan coined the phrase, the medium is the message. So the actual ways we use to communicate something is actually a message in itself. What effect do you think the internet as a medium has had on the way we talk about politics and public policy?
It's hurt our attention spans, says she who spent the last 15 years on the internet. I think one thing that's important, it's of course all the social media, new media experts say, and I think they're right to some degree, that you have to tailor your message, obviously, for whatever forum you're on. If you're on Twitter, oh my goodness, you have to get your message in in those tight parameters. But I do think it does create a little fun, creative possibilities for people as well. But I think, again, not to sound like a broken record, I think the important thing when we're doing these things is to make sure that we have the big picture in mind as we're tweeting and Facebooking and all the rest, and make sure that we're still doing deliberative thinking and also not getting caught up in things. You know, Bill Bennett, who I know is speaking tomorrow morning, has a new book called The Book of Man, and it's essentially the book of virtues aimed at men. You know, stories about heroic men and prayers for good men and lots of great stories and poems and things. But he has an entire chapter on reflection and prayer. And I thought, well, how countercultural is that as we're, sort of tweeting our lives away? Sometimes it feels like it's important, I think, to make use of all these. The National Review, for instance, has always sort of made use of whatever the new media outlet, the new alternative option is, try to make sure we're getting our message out that way too, because there are new people, perhaps, especially young people, frankly, that we can reach that way. But always by not watering down what, at the end of the day, is your mission and your purpose. So always making sure that while you're tweeting and being on Facebook and all these great things, you're also taking time out to remember what your mission is and what you're all about and why it is you're doing that stuff in the first place. Because you're not doing it just to hit refresh or tweet. If you are, then we're doing something wrong, right?
Well, I think the internet as a medium is kind of like a teenage girl. When my daughter was young, whatever was important in her life right then was the most important thing in the world, and 5 minutes later it'd be forgotten. And I think we see this yesterday when Steve Jobs died. Everybody had to say something about it. Now, Steve Jobs was a great businessman. I love my Apple products. But 2 weeks from now, or even 2 days from now, people aren't going to be as concerned. And the question is, how does this fit into the broader story that we should be telling ourselves? And as Christians, especially, we should be concerned with the eternal perspective. So how does this fit in there? And so I think the medium of the internet just compounds a problem that started with TV and newspapers, and that's the dailiness. That news makes us dumb because it doesn't connect the little bits into a broader narrative. If somebody would give you a newspaper that was dated 2 weeks ago, you would be like, well, I don't want to read this. This is old news. Well, if it's not relevant today, 2 weeks later, why was it relevant 2 weeks ago?
If I get the morning paper a couple of hours later, I don't bother reading it, I confess.
And the internet has just compounded that. Now, if I don't read, Ed Morrissey stuff in the morning, by the afternoon, everybody's like, oh, that's old news. We've already talked about that. We've moved on to another topic. And
so depressing for some of us who occasionally write 1,000 words.
and that's exactly it. And I think that's what we need to do as conservatives, especially conservatives in media, is try to fit into the broader narrative. We can't completely do away with the dailiness of the minute-by-minute TikTok, but we can kind of try to fit things into perspective and try to make it where what matters today, because we're undermining conservatism when we focus on what's important right now rather than what's going to be important in 20 years from now.
Let me turn this on its head for just a minute, because I think that the internet is actually, as a medium, has done something different than transforming the message. It's transformed the consumer. Again, because I'm an old fogey, I'm going to put you back 30 years. And what I said in the beginning, you had, for most of us, there was only one newspaper in town, and you had three broadcast networks to choose to get your news from. Now you have thousands, tens of thousands of outlets across the country, in your local state and community, and you are now able to be wise consumers of the news. And I don't mean, the New York Times. I hate the New York Times, so I'll never read a New York Times article. There are good writers at the New York Times. There are good writers at the Washington Post. Both of those newspapers have their issues in covering social conservatives, but being wise means picking and choosing through the things that are truthful, and knowing what your sources are, being wise about what it is that you're reading, being wise about where it is that you're getting your information. And that means doing some homework. But that's because we have, again, a blessing of abundance here. And thankfully, because we have a country, a nation that produces this kind of abundance, we have an abundance of information sources now. And so we now have the ability, where we did not have that ability 25, 30 years ago, to be wise consumers, to be able to choose, to select and choose what sources we're going to look at, to almost like a smorgasbord, a little from here, a little from there. Oh, I think that this particular reporter is pretty good. Jake Tapper at ABC, I'll just throw that one out there, is very good. I like reading Jake's stuff. It's usually accurate, and it's usually timely, and he challenges everybody basically on what it is that they're trying to say.
So has the emergence of conservative outlets eliminated media bias? I mean, the cat's out of the bag with MSNBC, I think.
Well, I mean, let's just be honest. Everyone has a bias, right? So I've always thought that the New York Times and the Washington Post and all should come out of the closet, so to speak, and just be more like the European papers, where you're getting a conservative paper or you're getting a left-wing paper or whatnot. So, of course, media bias has not been eliminated. But having these alternative media outlets and having this populist approach, too, where in a locality you can be challenging, it's not just challenging the big guys, you're challenging the local paper as well, and maybe providing it. I know the Franklin Center and others provide local alternatives in the terms of setting up an internet website that'll counter the local paper, provide an alternative to the local big paper. But one thing, when Ed mentioned Jake Tapper, of course, media bias has not been eliminated, but sometimes the New York Times and the Washington Post and the LA Times, et cetera, actually do run fair stories, or stories that really do just tell a story, and it just happens to be the story that is true. And every once in a while, there might be a sentence or a phrase here or there that you might take issue with. But if you see a reporter or an editor or a paper in general being fair to religious people, to conservatives, whatever it is, thank them. I think it's worth thanking them, because I certainly know, having an email address available publicly by my bylines, that people, generally speaking, only say, I don't like what you're saying. They actually say it in
emails too?
Yeah, and actually that's not what they say. I can't say it on C-SPAN or at a conservative family forum, what they actually say. But people rarely say thank you. A pastor friend of mine says, if you like the pastor's sermon on Sunday, you should tell him, because probably other people thought, oh, that was a good sermon, but they didn't say anything. I think that's particularly important, frankly, I think it's important for us to establish relationships with people in the mainstream media as conservatives, as activists, as just people faith-filled people in the community, to not treat the media as if it's an enemy. Will they sometimes be hostile and be enemy-like? Yes, sure. But if you show them that you show a particular reporter or an editor or the newsroom, if you're not in it yourself, if you show them you're a human being with just an alternative worldview, which, oh, by the way, a lot of people happen to share, I think that makes a difference. It can make a difference. It certainly can. And God's grace can work it out if we can't. We don't have the talent for it.
Well, I don't think we're necessarily to the point where we're conservative liberal bias is balanced yet, but I think we're to the point now where we have to start being concerned about conservative bias. Because there's certain biases, particularly in the conservative movement, a bias toward activism and toward a particular agenda. And what happens is, because they need a big tent for elections, they kind of flatten out all the perspectives so they're all equal. Well, in my perspective, libertarianism and traditional conservatism are not equal. And they should not be treated as equal in certain formats. So I think the key is that no matter what media outlets we're listening to, liberal or conservative, we should think for ourselves critically, and how does it fit to our purposes and what we want to get out of it.
You're never going to eliminate media bias. And to Joe's point, the more we have mainstream conservative outlets, you're not going to eliminate bias there either. These media outlets are run by people who have to make editorial decisions, and generally speaking, the biases inform those, and it's usually not a nefarious plot, it's just people being human. And that's the reason why it's important to have a whole range of choices and to be very judicious about knowing who these sources are, knowing what their reliability is, and that's incumbent upon us to know that.
So not everyone here obviously has the platform that you guys do to speak from. So what can the average
Literally,
values...
there are only 4 people on the stage.
True.
What can the average values voter, social conservative, do to further the conservative movement with the media they have available, like, with their Facebook page, with their Twitter account, with their email? I mean, what are some practical things that they can do to help further the movement?
I would like to say that the biggest, most important thing is our approach. And I think we should be focused on and remember that beauty testifies to truth. It doesn't matter how true the conservative movement is, the principles we have. If we don't present them in an attractive way and that seems beautiful to people and that they want to be like that, it's not gonna be effective. And I think our model for this should be the greatest broadcaster in radio history, and that's Paul Harvey. That man probably did more for the conservative movement than any 10 other broadcasters in history. I mean, it's hard to imagine there'd be the Reagan Revolution without Paul Harvey. And the reason why is because he presented an affable, winsome approach to conservatism. Most people probably didn't even know he was conservative, but he just presented conservative principles and presented a way of life and a vision of America that made it attractive. And I think if we were able to do that, if we had 1,000 people who acted like Paul Harvey and presented a message like that, we could transform America.
I think what you just said is so important, Joe. I think we have to be welcoming while clearly coming from a particular point of view and believing certain things that we're not going to give on. Do you actually want to listen to what you're saying? You want to make sure that you can tolerate and like the sound of your own voice and what you're saying and the words you're using. And are you being loving, in the course of what you're saying in the battle, so to speak? Not so to speak, but are you attracting people to things that are good and beautiful and that which motivates you in your daily life? And I think also, in addition to being on Facebook or Twitter or whatever it is you're doing to communicate in your parishes or your local groups, whatever it is you're doing, I think also making use of, if you see Joe Carter's written a fantastic article for First Things, using that as maybe a point of discussion for a group, or perhaps there's a good program actually on. I've been an evangelist for this new PBS series on Catholicism, which amazingly is a priest talking about Christianity, just sort of openly and confidently. But he's doing it in high-definition television, and it looks beautiful, and it looks good, and you don't have to agree with everything he says. It's just good TV. So if you see something like that, buy the DVD and show it around town. If there's a good, Laura Ingraham interview, because I know she's coming up next on Bill O'Reilly, use that as a discussion. Not because I knew she'd hear me. I'm not that much of a suck-up. But I make use of, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. I think that's very important for conservatives all the time. There are good groups around town, for instance. When you're the new guy in town, you should make use of some of those resources, for instance. And I think we all, as a national community, should make use of the resources that are already out there when we're doing our own work in communities, or on Facebook, or wherever it is.
Well, I think you should listen to Laura Ingraham every day. I am that much of a suck-up, actually, so. Look, the best thing that you can do is tell your story. You're the one who knows your story. You can tell your story best. Tell it from a positive point of view. Find a way that feels comfortable for you. If that is in small group sharing in your communities, do that. If that is by putting it out on a Facebook page, do that. If you feel comfortable about writing a blog, do that. If you feel even more comfortable about getting involved in media as a profession, do that. Maybe I'm one of the very fortunate people here who had a completely different career 8 years ago, and I just followed where I felt I was being led, And it has opened many, many doors to me. And I am very, very privileged to be able to be on this platform. And in large part, it's because of people like you who have been reading me, who have been, retweeting me, who have been emailing me and emailing my stories around. And I deeply, deeply appreciate that. But all of us have gifts. And the Lord gives us all gifts so that we can share them and make the world better. And I think that there are probably a tremendous amount of stories here that would inspire others to action. And so tell your stories. Find the way that feels comfortable for you. Tell your stories. And I guarantee you that as a movement, we can change the world by doing that.
I think that's some great advice. You can find all these guys online. Joe Carter's at firstthings.com, nationalreview.com, and hotair.com. Let's thank our guests. Thank you.